Payslip is an AI-powered global payroll control platform and the leading provider of automation and integration as a service technology for the delivery and management of global payroll at large multinational companies. Payslip automates the end-to-end payroll process, from pre-payroll data collection and validation through to post-payroll last-mile reporting. The Payslip platform empowers multinationals to fix payroll challenges, digitize multi-country payroll and connect systems and processes for faster and smarter payroll management. A Workday partner, Payslip standardizes and automates workflows across HR, finance and global payroll, integrating the entire payroll ecosystem. Global organizations choose Payslip to manage their global payroll operations with visibility and control, achieve execution excellence, see a bigger picture and scale at any dimension. With Payslip, they are able to harness payroll data for actionable insights and fully informed, real-time decision-making. Payslip helps companies move from manual, disjointed legacy payroll to digitized and standardized processes across countries with powerful integrations which remove choke points in payroll operations. Find out more at payslip.com.
Hello and welcome back to Global PayFest 26. I am Natalie Lloyd and I'm here with Ger Adlum, Marketing Manager of Payslip, for our Switzerland session. Welcome, Ger. How are you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalie. Delighted to be here. I'm great. Very honored to be representing Switzerland, wonderful country that it is. I've got some very good friends who live in Zurich, so I'm happy to be here waving the Swiss flag, nominally at least.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to focus our session on preparing for the all-important EU Pay Transparency Directive. So I think we should go straight into having a look at what that looks like for our global payroll leaders who are going to be tuning in today. Ger, what is the EU Pay Transparency Directive in simple terms?
Yeah, a good place to start. At a very simple level, at a high level, the directive is about making compensation more transparent. Yes, that's in the title, but also more accountable and ultimately more equitable. But of course, in all of this, Natalie, it's about the rules and the regulations that are being brought in to actually help achieve that and the mechanisms around it. So I think, to answer that question, we almost need to look at it from an organizational level, how the shift compares to what countries that already have some level of pay gap reporting legislation in place already, and how this new directive is changing that, unraveling what's already in place in some instances, and bringing in a whole new raft of rules and regulations in others. And I think for us at Payslip, the headline here is that the EU Pay Transparency Directive is moving organizations away from simple reporting outcomes and towards a requirement to be able to explain how pay decisions are actually made, both internally and externally. And I think the way we have to think about this is that is the mechanism, the driver towards equitable pay. And in doing so, hopefully, we can begin to close that 13% pay gap between men and women across the EU. So I think, Natalie, in terms of what is it, we have to understand that this is not about publishing a pay gap number. This is about answering questions like, if a pay gap exists, then why does it exist? How are pay decisions made within your organization? The rationale behind them? Are those decisions consistent? Are they defensible? Are they equitable? And are they based on, to quote the directive, objective, gender-neutral criteria? And on the face of it, maybe that might sound easy enough, but obviously those of us who are in the payroll space know that historically, pay structures, such as they have evolved over time. You have organizations that responded during a particularly difficult hiring market, where talent was commanding a premium, or you have the quirks of individual negotiations where people were able to negotiate for themselves a higher salary that perhaps puts them out of the band you've got. You might have had mergers, acquisitions, all of which mean that you end up inheriting pay structures that now have to be reconciled in the context of your overall pay structure. And so There might also be inherently inequitable pay decisions that have been made within your organization. There's no point of pretending otherwise. That also could be a factor. But I think all of that taken together, Natalie, that creates imbalances and creates pay discrepancies. And yes, you end up with a system that is not always easy to explain because it was not designed. It is a collection of individual decisions made at different times. And so I suppose to round it off, long answer to a short question, Natalie, I do apologize. I am Irish after all. The EU Pay Directive, I think, is forcing organizations to step back, look at those internal structures and systems more critically now, and where necessary, implement changes and address those pay inequalities. So it's asking, do you have a clear structure? Are decisions made on objective, gender-neutral criteria? And can you stand over those decisions if they're challenged, whether that's internally or externally?
Perfect. And I think we've been hearing EU Pay Transparency for a long time now. And all of a sudden, it seems like everything is in a hurry. I know there's certain countries that are experiencing delays. Why is it right now that this is becoming such a priority?
Yeah, you're right. Obviously, we have actually known that the EU Pay Directive was coming since it was published in May 2023. So we've known it was on the horizon. Member states have been told that they need to transpose the directive into national law by June 2026, which is quite close, with the first reports due in June 2027. So obviously, the timelines now are quite real. And so that's why we're seeing that additional fire being lit under HR leaders and senior leaders. They're suddenly realizing, actually, this is getting quite close. And what seemed, in 2023 or even 2024 or 25, like a long-term compliance thing that was coming down the track, that, we've got time to get our house in order. Suddenly other projects come in ahead, they take priority. And now here we are almost towards the middle of 2026. And that pressure is starting to ratchet up. So, but as you said there, quite rightly, and some people on the call may be aware of this as well, several countries across the EU have already said that they will be pushing back legislation locally until perhaps early 2027. So Sweden, Denmark, Czechia, the Netherlands, for example, heavyweight EU countries, right? Significant influential countries within the EU bloc. So I think at this stage, it's increasingly likely that other countries might well seek to do the same, even though the EU is insisting, no, the timelines, they remain what they are, we're not budging. But I think, Natalie, what these delays or the pushback against the timeline perhaps highlights is just how ill-prepared government bodies are in terms of what they actually want to implement, how they want to tweak things for their local jurisdiction, and actually how they're going to enforce the legislation. What penalties do they want to impose? What exactly are the details in terms of transparency and when a salary has to be communicated before the employee or the candidate interviews? All of these myriad things which require some consideration, it feels like governments have been dragging their heels on. I also think it perhaps is a reflection of how ill-prepared some companies are. That there's also a lot of lobby groups internally who are kind of saying, look, as companies, we're not ready for this. You need to push back. You need to tell the EU we're not in a position to row in behind what's being asked of us. So I think you have all of these things going on at once. It's a very confusing time. I think as a result, you're seeing a lot of organizations that are waiting for legislation to be published before they take significant action. From our perspective, again, at Payslip, we would recommend that is not a good idea. It's also not necessary because, big picture, we do broadly know what will be required by the directive. Yes, even if some elements have to be interpreted different locally, and as I say, penalties might vary from country to country. Okay, that's fine. All of that taken into consideration, we do know broadly what the directive is looking for. And we do know that sooner rather than later, this directive will be transposed across all EU members. And if you break it down, what organizations actually need to do to be ready, it's not really something that can be done quickly. It's not something that should be rushed either. You need to understand your current position, Are there pay gaps which exceed the 5% threshold allowed? If you're going to do that, that requires clean pay data to begin with, so you can do your high-level analysis. In parallel, you're going to want to be defining or ideally refining your existing job architecture so that you can compare rules properly. You are going to want to review and potentially redesign those pay structures. You may want to address existing pay gaps, right, that are beyond the 5% threshold to get you back down into that, green zone, if you like. But that has financial, that has organizational implications. And then around all of this, you're going to want to put governance controls, processes in place so that issues don't reappear, that gaps don't reemerge over time. All of that, Natalie, that could easily be a 12 to 18 month program taken all together. So I think what felt like a future compliance issue is now something that's a live project that needs to be actively worked on. I will say just one other thing that, obviously from our perspective, any potential delay is a good thing for companies themselves, right? Whatever you might think about the delay from a pay equality perspective, and in an ideal world, we'd all be ready to meet the deadlines as set by the EU because the spirit of the directive, I think, is right. But a longer runway will give companies more time to complete their reviews, implement a tech solution if necessary to help produce the analysis of the data, or hire external assistance if that's the route your company wants to go down, go through a remediation process if necessary, communicate the results of all of this to your employees, and ultimately be, quote unquote, in the clear by the time that first report is due, whether that's 2027 or 2028. So I don't think anybody on the operational side would begrudge a little bit of extra runway, but that remains to be seen.
I think I agree with you there, Ger. A big question that I think needs to be addressed at the very beginning here is a lot of people talk about the reporting side of this directive. Is that all it is?
No, it's definitely not. And I know why you would ask it. And I think it's something that we hear a lot too. I think probably that's the most important misconception that we see in the market. And it is really important to address it. So I'm glad you asked it like that, because I think a lot of this confusion is related to some of the existing pay gap legislation that's in place around Europe, where largely it is a reporting exercise, okay? You don't necessarily have to communicate anything internally. It's, this will sound crass, but essentially what it becomes is a PR exercise where you publish your number. You really hope that it doesn't get picked up and that you're not made a headline of. That kind of is largely what the EU pay legislation has been, with some tweaking here or there. But yeah, largely it's a reporting outcome. So the real work in terms of the EU Pay Transparency Directive sits underneath the reports. It's job architecture, pay philosophy. So if you don't have those in place, you will end up publishing a number that you cannot explain. And I think this is an important thing to clarify. The risk is not necessarily in the number itself. It's not necessarily that you're going to publish a figure which is above the 5% pay gap threshold. The risk is that you cannot account for it, that you cannot explain it. Again, to go back to the wording of the legislation, objective, gender-neutral criteria. There might be a good reason why there is a pay gap. It might still, be something that can withstand scrutiny, that it is defensible. So that's important to consider. But alongside of that, you also have all of the internal transparency requirements that have nothing to do with reports at all. And they apply to companies irrespective of size. And maybe that's an important point worth making. Some people are laboring under the idea that, oh, well, we're a small company, so the EU Pay Directive has nothing to do with us. We're too small, so we're not required to submit any reports at all. Or, we're basically out the gap, we're free. That's not true. You might not be obliged to submit a report, but other elements of the directive do apply to you. So that's why it's not just a reporting exercise. This is, conceptually how to think about it. It's a structural change in how organizations are defining, managing, and governing compensation. So yeah, it goes far beyond reporting, even if that's the headline, and that's going to preoccupy senior leadership, which I think is why you asked that question. I think why people have that feeling that it's senior leadership who are preoccupied with downstream, the report, when it comes out, how will it reflect on us? So yes, that's why it's grabbing the headlines, but so much more sits underneath it.
Absolutely. It's kind of giving that, the swan metaphor of like, everything looks fab on top. And there's all of those other bits that go into it at the bottom that are the legs.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
With that kind of image in mind, how prepared would you say organizations are in reality at the moment?
Yeah. Look, obviously, there are some organizations that have been planning for this well in advance. And maybe that's companies that were in the fortunate position of being, really well resourced in terms of HR. So they had the bandwidth to assign people to start looking at this, that they had the bandwidth from an IT perspective to start getting the data ready. Absolutely, companies like that exist. But again, from the conversations that we have had with senior HR and payroll leaders, it does feel like a lot of organizations are, at the very least, much earlier in the journey than they would like to be. But I think what has shifted in the last 12 months is people are moving from the awareness that something is coming down the tracks to that sort of, okay, we are in live project mode now. We are beginning, at the very least, to scope out what is being required. And that's a really positive thing. But what happens is, when you move from that awareness phase, let's call it, to the live project, that's when the gaps start to appear really quickly. And now you realize, okay, actually, perhaps there's more work to do here than we initially thought. I think in particular, that's true for companies who have been operating in countries where there was some level of pay legislation in place, right? They're used to going through a reporting cycle. And so therefore they think, okay, actually, we've done this before, right? To some extent, we know what this is. And then they start to dig into the actual, to the letter requirements of this directive. And they realize that actually, perhaps we're not as well placed as we thought we were. The first gap that emerges is in terms of the data. So one of the big points of differentiation between this legislation and pre-existing legislation is the volume of data, or the scope of data that's required in order to conduct this analysis. In so many instances, it has just been base pay. Okay, the inequity or equity is calculated based on just salaries. The directive from the EU goes much further. It is all forms of pay data, all forms of remuneration. And when I say that, there will be people listening who are going, but what about variable pay? That's the one that's the hardest to get our heads around and to calculate and to sort of consolidate. Yes, it is.
It counts.
And that's why this is causing so much head scratching and, frustration, because historically as well, let's be honest, variable data is the one that's most easy to kind of fudge in terms of who gets paid a bonus, who doesn't, what is the criteria on which a bonus is allocated. A lot of those things, for good reason, are left at the individual discretion of a manager. I'm not saying that's wrong in and of itself. The point is, the rationale behind it is not always well documented. And that is the gap that is created, wherein you cannot explain your numbers. So again, I think that's maybe the first thing that people realize, that, okay, that's actually hindering our preparation. So the data is not clean. You end up with a spider's web of pay elements. You've got inconsistent naming conventions. You'll have BNS. You'll have bonus one, bonus underscore one, bonus with a capital B. All of these, sort of different naming conventions that companies have cobbled together over time. Someone added in a rogue pay element and didn't tell anybody, and it sits in the system. You've got duplicates of data sets. All of this goes on, okay? And payroll people listening in will be laughing along because they'll recognize that scenario. But all of that, it makes it much more difficult to produce a clean set of data from which to begin the analysis. And again, for payroll people listening in, I would imagine that is mostly where they're being asked to plug into this project. They are the custodians of the pay data, so they are the ones who will be asked by whoever the project lead, perhaps the senior HR figure, where is the pay data? We need it. Can you supply it? Can you run that initial pay data analysis to give us an initial understanding of our position. And yeah, very quickly, payroll people know that is easier said than done. And then, look,
sure.
I think just to, quickly tie a bow on it again, Natalie, you've asked an Irish person a simple question. He's given you a complicated answer. But I think the second thing that emerges is just job structures. Again, so many companies, irrespective of size, they don't have a consistent documented job architecture. And that means it is very difficult to define what equal work means in practice. And to go back to the directive, it's work of equal value, okay, or equal work. That is what you were trying to compare one job versus another, or one person in that role versus another. Are they doing equal work? It's not about the job title. It's about actually the day-to-day duties that they've got. That's what you're judging it on. So do you have a job architecture that has clearly defined roles and responsibilities? Can you group those jobs into families or categories of work? And then within that, assigning levels, grades based on scope, complexity, impact, whatever your criteria might be. That is the basis for determining equal work or work of equal value. So it's essential for analyzing. You can't just produce the numbers without the structure that sits behind it. And then lastly, process. Do you have a structure in place to make sure that these issues won't just repeat themselves in 12 months' time, and you find yourself going through this entire remediation project again, and you're sitting there cursing yourself, wishing that you had put a structure in place so that you weren't having to jump through all of these hoops again. So yeah, that's where companies are sitting in terms of preparation, largely, with some outliers.
Yeah, so there's definitely that kind of like perception versus reality piece there of, if you've already got some element of this reporting in your organization or in your country, there can be that perception that, like, don't worry, this will be easy. It will be a couple of months to kind of implement across the business. And then when you look into the directive as a whole and everything that's included and all of the kind of everything you have to do to lead up to that being ready, that reality is quite different, I think.
It is. And I can tell you, Natalie, the people saying, oh, this will be easy are not the payroll people. I can guarantee you that. They are the ones with their heads screwed on going, we know how difficult it's going to be to pull all this together. So yeah. Rule of thumb, listen to your payroll leader.
Someone says it's easy.
Yeah.
I think you touched on this really lightly, but there are countries where, there's already laws in place. Switzerland itself has pay equity laws already. How do those laws compare to the EU Pay Transparency Directive? What is different?
Yeah. And Switzerland, whom I am representing today, as I said, very happily so, is a really useful example. Obviously, Switzerland not in the EU, but already has some pay gap legislation in place. They've got the Gender Equality Act, and that's a really interesting point of comparison. So very quickly on that, and any Swiss experts can pick me up in the comments if I'm in any way wrong, but under that legislation, companies with 100 or more employees have to conduct a pay equity analysis. But the key difference is that essentially that is a one-off requirement. You reach that threshold of 100 employees, you're obliged to conduct the analysis. Once you've done it and you are, maybe you're in excess of the threshold and you complete a remediation process and you've proven that, and the auditor has given you the quote unquote green stamp, and you demonstrate you don't have a pay gap anymore, there is no ongoing obligation to repeat that analysis. So it's a very strong sort of first diagnostic step, but it does not create a continuous process. And that's maybe the fundamental point of difference between what this directive is asking. The directive takes a more continuous approach. Instead of one-off analysis, you're going to have to regularly assess the pay equity position. Depending on the size of your organization, it could be annually or it could be every 3 years. But that is significant because obviously pay gaps are not static. If you address them at one point in time, they can absolutely reappear through hiring decisions, promotions, or just the natural structural drift within an organization. People come, people go, you size up, you size down. So The EU approach is more about designing sort of embedded pay equity structures into your ongoing operations. So there's a system of regular monitoring and accountability, perhaps is the best way to say it.
For sure. It kind of takes away that, you know, sometimes if you've got an exam, you'll like cram in the night before. You don't have to do anything else for the rest of the year, as long as you get the good grade. Like it's the opposite. It's like you need to keep learning, keep developing the way you're doing things, keep it on track.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's kind of those differences of like, there's no such thing as a one and done here. It is designed to make sure that it's an ongoing process and that things don't slip. Yeah,
exactly. It's exactly that. I trust, Natalie, you were an A student, so there was no overnight cramming for you.
No. So what about organizations where, you know, some of the countries that they operate in already have some of these laws, some are just seeing these laws or directives come in for the first time, and then there's parts of their organization in different parts of the world where none of that is required. Do you think that they will start to see it as more of a global thing and report across their whole business, or just in areas?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think, that it's that primary question of if you have employees across the EU, and then like for this example, you also have some in Switzerland, or, you know, you've got some in North America, wherever, it doesn't really matter. The point is, that fundamental question, do you build and maintain separate processes for employees in each jurisdiction? Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting that people and companies in Switzerland are going to start submitting reports that they weren't asked for. I don't mean that, but I do mean in terms of pay transparency and employee rights to information. So one of the big things under the directive is that you have, as an employee, a right to understand your salary in comparison to others doing equal work or work of equal value. So what we're already seeing is that organizations that are in that position, where they've got some employees in the EU and others elsewhere, they're choosing to align to the highest standard of transparency. In this case, that's the EU directive. And why? Well, because if you don't, you are just fundamentally creating an imbalance between employees, and it's going to be an obvious one, right? If you know of employees who are based in France, maybe they're on your team, right? For example, they might not even be in a different department. They could be people that you're engaging with every day, and you know that they have a better fundamental understanding of their salary and where it compares to other people within the organization. But I, as the employee outside of the EU, cannot have that information. Irrespective of what the law is, it is just going to create a friction and an us and them kind of atmosphere. So where the local legislation is less demanding, I think organizations are probably choosing to adopt a more consistent EU-aligned approach right across the board. So, but I think as part of that, like it will be really interesting to see how Switzerland, for example, might evolve its approach over time. There are already sort of employer or employee rights lobby groups and organizations that are actively demanding more pay transparency in Switzerland right now at the moment. So I think there's a better than likely chance, to pull out the crystal ball just for a moment. I might do my lotto numbers while I'm at it. But there is a chance that Swiss law will monitor and, you know, probably increase transparency into future iterations of the legislation anyway, just because it makes sense. That's the direction of travel that we're seeing globally anyway, towards greater transparency. So I think there's every chance that they will just update the letters of the legislation. It just makes more sense rather than creating this two-tier system across Europe. I think so.
Yeah, and it kind of touches on why we chose this topic for this hour, is that, you know, Switzerland has been seen as a country who's been really ahead in this, and who's almost been leading the way in transparency and in that massive employee experience piece that having that transparency creates.
And by the way, Natalie, I think there's lots that companies can learn from what Switzerland have in place as well. Like even down to sort of how pay equity is analyzed. So under Swiss law, it's really prescriptive. And one of the great things about it, credit to the Swiss, they can be good at this kind of stuff, it's really clear on what you need to show to the auditor. And that's great. Like, so that there's a very clearly documented regression-based methodology that is validated and externally audited. That's fantastic. It's really robust. It's really clear on what you need to do to get your green stamp of approval and sort of be cleared. And I think, you know, that is possibly something that the EU could have taken a little bit more from, because the EU directive, on the face of it, it's sort of worded simpler, right? It's requiring equal pay analysis based on categories of workers doing equal work or work of equal value. But it doesn't actually prescribe the method for doing that. So it's sort of an odd thing where it holds you accountable for the result, but it's not telling you exactly the way you should go about doing it. So the problem there will be that if you find yourselves in a position where you're reporting on a gap above that 5% threshold, and you're going to need to explain it. If you're going to explain it, the logic here being that if you are publishing that figure, you must think you can explain it, because otherwise you should have remediated already and closed the gap. So if you're publishing that figure, it implies that you can explain it. But you won't be able to explain it unless you do a sort of Swiss-like methodology of regression-based analysis of the data to be able to explain why you have that figure. So it's one of those things where the EU approach is maybe a little less prescriptive on paper, but actually when it comes down to it, you are going to be required to do that deep level of analysis in order to explain the figures. And the Swiss have shown how that can be done, or what the methodology is. So yeah, there's a little bit to be taken from it. And I suppose that's can be the good thing about sort of, you know, legislation like this. You should be able to borrow from what other countries have done well and implement it better, because you're coming to it a little bit later. And in some respects, the EU has done that. In others, I think they could have taken more time and borrowed some of the better things from other legislation around the world. But that's neither here nor there. Not the focus of this exact conversation. Another time.
Absolutely. And it's always one of those things that evolves, isn't it? I know, you know, for a lot of organizations, for a lot of countries, this is the first time they will ever do anything like this. And a starting point is better than nothing.
I think so.
So I think we keep hearing, definitely in line with what we've been speaking about so far, is that term readiness. What is that? What's the starting point? I think maybe that's data readiness.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I'm chuckling here at the spirit in which you ask it, because you're right. The phrase is, "Are you ready for EU Pay Transparency? How do we get ready?" And very few people are actually articulating what readiness might look like. So I think the starting point does have to be data. People will say, "Am I contradicting myself, Ger? You said at the start this is not a reporting exercise, so why is data the most important step?" It's because clean, comprehensive pay data is the foundation on which you can begin to understand your position. You don't just need it for reports, you need it for the internal communications aspect as well. So you have to be able to answer basic questions about your pay clearly and consistently. You will not be able to do that unless you have a clean data set to begin working for. So you can explain, what are we paying people? How does it vary? Where are the gaps? And I think in a lot of organizations, that is way more difficult than it sounds. As I said, EU Pay Transparency Directive is looking at all forms of remuneration. And so much of that data, again, payroll people will nod along here because they see it every day. So much of that data is fragmented. It's living across different systems. It's living across different providers, potentially. And where the data does exist, it may not be structured consistently within countries. It may not be consistently structured, France versus the quality and state of our German data, or our Spanish data, or our Irish data, or whatever it is. So already within global organizations anyway, or just multi-country, you know, they could be in 2 or 3 countries, does not have to be 9, 10, 11. But the point is, there are already probably inconsistencies in their data sets from country to country. Now, that's fine insofar as, you know, you're not required to do country by country comparisons or anything, but it does cause friction or confusion in terms of getting ready in each of those countries. Some countries are going to be more work than others, just by virtue of the fact that the data is already in a better state in one country versus another. So good data means complete, consistent, and I would say accessible. Okay, on demand, be able to put your hand to the data when you need it. And again, many companies will have the pay data, right? They'll have no shortage of data. They're swimming in data. The problem is that it's locked away, contained within hundreds and hundreds of spreadsheets that all need to be manually reconciled. So that's a phenomenal amount of work. And, you know, when a senior leader says, oh yeah, we'll just get the data in place and we'll do the analysis, they often don't have a clue just how much work is required. And I don't mean that pejoratively, right? That's not their area of focus, so they don't see it every day, but payroll people do. They know just how difficult it is to consolidate all of that data, and do so very often, unless you have a solution in place to help you do it, it requires significant manual effort. And unfortunately, without that foundation, everything else required by the directive becomes difficult, if not impossible. So yeah, that's certainly the first step. But I think, but there is more to it than that. Like it isn't just about data, right? Because you can get that already. You can conduct your pay analysis. It's still going to lead to conversations. And that, I think, more than anything, is what people are underestimating here. Transparency is a good thing, right? If we think about the spirit of the directive, there are some very laudable things that it's asking of us, and there are laudable goals that it's trying to achieve. That's fantastic. On the ground, internally, operationally, it's going to create very awkward conversations potentially that managers are going to have to deal with. Or it might be, you know, companies appoint one single HR person who's going to handle all of these conversations for every employee. I don't know how sustainable or possible that will be, but that is a possible approach, right? You still need to, I suppose, be able to articulate those decisions and those pay positions consistently, right? So how prepared are your managers to articulate the pay philosophy? Can they do it consistently for every single conversation that they have? Okay, that what they say to Peter on a Monday is the same as what's said to Paula on a Tuesday. It's the same criteria, the same rationale, the same quality of explanation. I think so often managers are not typically trained to do that, because it hitherto hasn't really been a requirement.
Yeah.
I think you could get away with, again, this will sound pejorative, I don't necessarily mean it that way, but you could get away with kind of fudging an answer. That won't be good enough now. There's the exquisite pressure of legislation behind this. So yeah, I think providing a short FAQ or even a document to prepare managers probably isn't going to be enough, right? They need to understand the structure, the rationale, the capacity to communicate it. So yeah, we might be back to the two most feared words in all of business, which is role playing. You might be back to doing some of that to get people ready for it, so that they have had some practice of actually saying this stuff out loud. And yeah, I think the fear would be that people are putting that side of it off, and they don't need to. That should be happening concurrently, really, with the data readiness side of it. I'd say one other thing to do with people readiness also, I'd say to people, don't underestimate how early you need to involve leadership in this. I think from the moment you have even that first pass analysis of your pay equity position, and the moment you sense you may have a threshold above that 5%, senior leadership needs to be engaged, because there is a very good chance you're going to have to go through a remediation process. That's going to cost money. That's going to be organizational shift, and you're going to need the buy-in and that conversation started with leadership to be able to do that effectively. And then I suppose, yeah, look, again, long answer here, I know, I'm sorry, but process readiness is probably the third thing. And that kind of is actually how we've been thinking about in terms of Payslip and the advice we're giving, and some of the documentation we've produced, which I might give a plug out at the end if people want to download it a little bit more. But we're thinking of it in terms of data, people, and process. And the process angle is, what now are going to be the mechanisms, the structures, and the people appointed that you put in place to make sure that this is a living, breathing project that is always on, that you are not, to use your delightful analogy of cramming the night before the exam, that you're not doing that you are always monitoring. Doesn't mean you're on it every day, but maybe it's once a quarter, once every 6 months. As corn as there are big shifts in terms of, we went on a hiring spree, or we know that a significant number of people were promoted or exited the business, whatever it is, that someone or some small team is keeping an eye on your position all the time. So if necessary, you can make small changes incrementally to keep you below the threshold, to keep everything, ticking along as you would like it to, and not leaving it up until a month or two before the report is due. And suddenly you realized, oh my goodness, a pay gap in this category has emerged out of nowhere. I don't understand. We were at 4%, now we're at 5.5 or 6. How did this happen? Really, you should now have a mechanism in place to make sure that it doesn't catch you by surprise. So yeah, data, people, process, to begin to demystify what readiness looks like anyway, Natalie. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. I think, that last bit that you touched on there of having a actual process and sticking to it and making sure that it's like continuous is really important, because you mentioned that some organizations are going to have one person doing this whole thing, or potentially one team. It's not always going to be huge organizations that have a whole compliance team. It will be someone like whoever is watching this who is all of a sudden tasked with this thing they've never done before. And people might move within the business, they might leave the business, and then that next person is faced with absolute chaos. So making sure everything's well documented is super, super important. And what you said there about the triangle of data, people, and process, that's so important. The more you were speaking, the more I was thinking there's absolutely no way you could have one without the other.
No, I don't think so. Genuinely, 2 out of 3 is going to catch you out, right? So as we said, the data is the non-negotiable. You can't go through the analysis of your job architecture and define all your salary bands, right? Defining the criteria on which someone is paid at the top level of the band, the criteria on which someone might be at the minimum end of the band. There's sort of no point in doing that if that then doesn't align to your actual pay data. There's no point in having, this beautifully documented wish list of how we like the organization's compensation structure to be laid out if it isn't actually also backed up by the data to prove it. So you can't have one without the other. And yeah, as we said, if people aren't prepared to actually push this through, right, either in terms of their buy-in to the project, their understanding of what needs to be done, their capacity to articulate to employees, and if leadership is not on board, then the work you do with the data will all be for nothing anyway. And yeah, lastly, if you don't have structures in place, well, then you are going to find yourself going through this same process every 12 months. And that's going to be painful. Nobody wants that. So yeah, get the holy trinity correct between the three of them.
Perfect. And then I think it's probably important to talk about, yes, we need to get this right, but not everyone is perfect every single time. So where is it that things typically may go wrong?
Yeah, good question. I think, I won't go down the data road again. I think I've made that point well. I think where people maybe misunderestimate gaps in the process is they assume that they have an understanding of their pay position, and they might. Okay, they might have a fairly good grasp of why we pay people, what we pay them, but is it documented? That is the thing that's going to catch you out, because it's only in the documentation of a thing that you can really defend it. Like, that is the thing that's going to make this consistent as well across the board. So it's not enough to kind of think you have an understanding of your pay bands and your salary structures. You actually have to have it documented, and that is the basis on which you can then begin to articulate that criteria by which people are paid. Like, as I just said there, what is the factor that makes someone receive money at the higher end of the salary band that we've laid out? Okay, fine. It's all right to have someone potentially paid more than another person if there is equitable criteria, so long as it is not based on, the opposite of the wording of the legislation, which would be subjective or gender-based criteria. That's what you're trying to avoid, and the documentation of the criteria is what allows you to sort of pass that part of the legislation. Clearly document why people are paid what they're paid, the criteria on which we award compensation at one level or another, the criteria based on which we award variable pay. Okay, how does someone actually earn a bonus in this category of work within our organization? That, I would say, is the tedious work to a certain extent, right? I'm not saying that this is going to be a really enjoyable project for people to work on. It's not. It can be tedious to do it, but that is the work that will stand you in good stead long term. And then you've got to hope that, hiring managers stick within those bands. Right? That's part of the work of HR overall as well, to make sure that everybody is making decisions and singing off the same hymn sheet. So yeah, that would be our perspective on it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, from the perspective of us as a recruitment company, we have already seen how that is changing the way job seekers and employees choose their long-term organizations to stay with. Those companies who already have some layers of transparency in the way that they show their salaries, in the way that they're honest with people about what the work that they're expected to do is, and what they will be compensated for that, and what they need to achieve to bring a bonus home at the end of the year. They're the companies that are winning talent from the get-go as well. This directive should play a massive part in equal opportunities for people and making sure that an individual can align themselves with an organization that's going to truly appreciate them for the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I think there's lots of this directive that is really, really positive and are the kinds of changes that people have been demanding for a long time. And some of it's stuff that companies are already doing. I think so often there's a tendency en masse when new legislation is introduced that, we think about it just in terms of operationally. Well, what am I going to have to do to be ready for this, right? Obviously, that's how humans are hardwired. We think about that first. But if we remove ourselves from that and we just think about the spirit of the directive, right? We can complain and we can argue over the letter of the directive and if it's as good as it could be, if it's as clear as it could be in areas, absolutely. But if we think about the spirit of it, lots of this is really, really positive. And as you said, stuff that companies have been doing anyway, like putting the compensation of the salary into the job description, right? Letting people know before they apply for it what the salary is. That's something that the directive is going to bring into place. Now, there'll be some differences in terms of at what point you have to reveal that information, right? It could be that it has to be in the job description, the job posting, or it could be that it's enough to email a candidate the salary before their first interview. But the principle is the same. You'll have employees who have the right to access information about their pay and how it compares to other employees doing comparable work. That's a really positive thing from an employee perspective. Employers will not be allowed to ask candidates their current salary or their salary history. Again, a lot of this is stuff that employee rights organizations would say, should have been the de facto way of operating for a long time anyway. So yeah, I think you're right in terms of, I totally understand your perspective from a hiring point of view and your view on the landscape. But yeah, a lot of this stuff is stuff that's going to be within your interest as a company to do anyway. It will give you, however slight, a competitive advantage in the hiring market. And ultimately, when you were hiring, that is what you were looking for. Something that says to an employee, this seems like the kind of company that I see myself in. That's all anyone who's hiring can ever try and do, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've mentioned a few times that there's going to be people watching this today who are doing this for the very, very first time and, are in one of those organizations where there's not a giant compliance team and all of a sudden they're their leadership team have come to them as the payroll professional and said, go on then, do the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
Yeah.
What should they prioritize? What is the next 12 months for those individuals?
Yeah, well, I think, look, people will be put in that position. The reality is this cannot be the sole work of one person. One person might lead the project, but there are so many moving parts in this. So say for anyone in that position, the first thing you need to do is articulate who the different stakeholders that are required are. And yeah, it will be in terms of mapping those stakeholders to the data, the people, and the process, right? So it has to be a structured progression, and it has to be a structured collaboration between all of the different stakeholders involved. To begin, that initial assessment and the data consolidation, get the pay data in a clean data set that you can begin your work from. Involve your HR leaders in terms of designing the structure of jobs and compensation plans within the organization and document it. Involve leadership where remediation is required, let them know what needs to be done. And then between you all, embed some level of governance and monitoring structure so that you're not just reaching a compliant state, but you're actually sustaining it long term. The other thing that I would say to people to do, Natalie, and this is where I am going to do a little plug, and I hope people don't mind, because it's you know, a couple of months ago, Payslip commissioned Anita Lettink, who may be well known to some of you, really respected HR advisor and payroll leader. We commissioned Anita to put together a 9-step guide to EU Pay Directive Transparency Readiness. A 9-step sort of, you know, stage by stage, what you need to do and what needs to be sort of accomplished, what your outputs should be at the end of each stage. We didn't write it. We deliberately wanted to keep ourselves out of it. We asked Anita to come in from a neutral perspective based on what she is seeing in the market and based on the advice that she is already giving to companies who are embarking on this project of what they actually need to do. So we've broken it down in terms of data, people, and process. 9 steps. Visit payslip.com. You will be, you know, inundated with it. You'll see a little pop-up probably down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and that will take you straight through it to download it. Or if not, go into resources and into the toolkit section, and you will find it there. It's been live for a couple of months. We've already had an overwhelming response to it. A lot of people downloading it, but more importantly, a lot of people getting in touch to say, thank you. This has been a really great point to start us mapping out this project and what we need to do. Because you're right, like you said it earlier on in this conversation, what does readiness look like? I think governments have been very slow on this to actually point to what people need to do to be ready for it. And that's because they themselves don't know what they need to do to be ready for it, right? But I think also so much of the analysis and the discourse has just been about the letter of the legislation, right? What the law requires. That's really important. But we sort of decided, or we saw in the market, that people hadn't gone that one step further and tell people what they need to do operationally to be ready to meet the requirements of the letter of the law. You know, there's no shortage of articles out there telling you what you're required to do, what the reporting thresholds are, what you'll have to do in terms of pay transparency. That's out there. But what has been missing, we think hitherto, has been an actual step by step, please tell me what I actually need to do in order to be ready to meet those requirements. And I believe that is what we've achieved with this guide. So that's my one plug that I'm going to do, Natalie.
And I think, you know, this is one of those things that is really, really accessible for people. Like, they can go and access this kit to understand how ready they are and what else they can do to prepare for this. I know a lot of the time people want to have somebody they can just talk to. So how else are Payslip helping those companies to prepare for the requirements that's out in the directive? And can someone just call you up?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, obviously, as a sort of a software-defined solution in the payroll market, we can help, and we are helping. So what we are doing, but I want to be really clear and specific on what we are doing, right? Because I think clarity is important in this, because there's so much obfuscation sometimes in the market about what people can do and and can't do. So I want to be really clear on how we're helping companies right now. So our existing clients, right, people who have been long-standing users of the Payslip platform, will already have had their data consolidated, right? That thing that I mentioned earlier on about the web of pay elements and different types of remuneration, variable, base, all of that kind of stuff, that already will have been consolidated within the Payslip platform, because that is just part and parcel of what the software was built to do. It was built to solve the data challenge that exists within Global Payroll. So it's not something that we have sort of tacked on, or it's not something that we've decided to build because we thought there was a market for it with the pay transparency coming down the tracks. It's actually something that's already been in the platform already, because it has always been a challenge within payroll. And again, people who work in Global Payroll who are listening into this conversation will know that it has historically been a challenge. That the visibility, the access to data, the having it all in one system and not locked away across hundreds and thousands of spreadsheets. So I guess that's the primary thing that we can help companies achieve. And yes, of course, for people who are not Payslip users, of course, we're absolutely welcoming those conversations for people who are scratching their heads, wondering how they're going to get their data in a clean, accessible data set. Absolutely, come and talk to us. We can help you do that. We can give you that, I suppose, raw material of good, clean data from which to begin this entire project. I mean, look, anecdotally, like we've even had companies that were on stream, let's say across 5 or 6 countries with us, and actually they've realized that because of how we solved the data problem, that the wider EU Pay Transparency project team have suddenly gone, oh, actually, if we brought on the rest of our EU countries, we'd be halfway there to solving this problem already. So we're seeing people sort of, double down in their investment in Payslip just because it actually can help them solve a big part of this problem. It's not all that we do. There's a whole lot more that obviously I won't get into now because it's beyond the scope of this conversation, but we can absolutely help you solve that data challenge and being ready to produce a report and being ready to hand someone the objective, clean data so that you can begin to understand your position and where your salary structure aligns or doesn't align with the facts of how your compensation is being meted out. So yeah, that's
amazing.
In a nutshell, Natalie.
I'm not even, managing this project myself, and I've kind of had a sigh of relief of like, oh wow, that is like step one. So
yeah, but look, but and again, not to be, and look, I don't want to be facetious about it. Like genuinely, but I don't want to be overly salesy about this either, because that's not what this is about. But there are solutions out there, and I think that's what people are coming to realize as well. There are technology solutions that can help you sort of do a lot of this manual work, which is going to be time consuming and also prone to errors. That is why technology, or good technology, should exist to automate and enhance wherein there are inefficiencies. And that's what good technology should do. So I'd encourage people that are embarking on this project, investigate the solutions that are out there. There is actually an easier way of going about this.
Thank you. Somehow, it must be the Irish in you, we're already reaching the hour. And I know that, there's going to be individuals that still have so many more questions, and it's so good to know that they genuinely can just pick up the phone and chat to you.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've obviously spent an hour asking you questions, and I do have one more. What I want to know is what one question leaders should be asking themselves in order to, prepare in relation to the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
Well, there's probably a few questions I'd encourage them to ask over the course of the project. But I think if there's one, maybe just fundamental underlying question, it's, honestly, hand on heart, can we explain every pay decision in our organization clearly and objectively? And there's a little semi-question afterwards. Would our explanation stand up to scrutiny? If the answer is no, then you have work to do. And the work is not finished until you can answer that question in the affirmative. So that's the question to ask. Can we explain the decisions within our organization? And is it objective and clear? If not, off you go.
Amazing. Ger, thank you so much. I think you have
Thank you.
unraveled so much in the space of an hour.
We covered a lot, Natalie, and there's probably an awful lot more. I would encourage people to download that guide, because it obviously has gone into even way more detail across those 9 steps than I ever could in an hour. So it's digestible, but it's robust. There's a lot in it. So yeah, off you go. Download it. There's lots more there.
You're a superstar, Ger. Thank you so much. To everyone watching, thank you so much. I really hope that you've now got those kind of stepping stones, and what's super important is that triangle to help you understand what readiness means, how to prepare, and what on earth the whole EU Pay Transparency Directive, mouthful, actually really means for you and your organization. So thank you for watching, Ger. Thank you again for joining us, and stick around for the next session.
Thanks very much. Up Switzerland.
See you soon.